July 14th, 1518, Strasbourg, Holy Roman Empire. On a narrow cobblestone street lined with half-timbered houses, a woman stepped out of her home into the sweltering summer heat. Her name was Frau Troffea, Mrs. Troffea, and what she was about to do would trigger one of the most bizarre and terrifying events in European history. Without warning, without music, without any apparent reason, Frau Troffea began to dance. Not the gentle, controlled movements of a formal dance. Not the joyful celebration of a festival. This was something else entirely: wild, frantic, compulsive movements that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her control. Her arms flailed, her legs jerked and kicked. She spun and twisted with an intensity that was immediately unsettling to anyone watching. Her husband rushed out, begging her to stop. Neighbors gathered, concerned and confused. But Frau Troffea couldn't stop, or wouldn't stop. She danced through the afternoon, through the evening, into the night, when exhaustion finally overcame her and she collapsed. People assumed that would be the end of it. A woman having some kind of fit or breakdown, nothing more. But after a few hours of rest, Frau Troffea stood up and began dancing again. She danced for days. Her feet became bloody. Her body grew gaunt. Still she danced, jerking and spinning to music only she could hear. And then, like a spark catching on dry timber, it spread. Within a week, 34 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. Within a month, the number had swelled to somewhere between 50 and 400. Historical accounts vary. They danced day and night, some until their hearts gave out, some until they collapsed from exhaustion and died where they fell. It would last for approximately 2 months, 2 months of horror, confusion, and death. 2 months when the streets of Strasbourg became a nightmarish ballroom where people danced not in joy, but in terror, unable to stop, their bodies betraying them in the most grotesque way imaginable. This is the true story of the dancing plague of 1518, one of history's most disturbing and inexplicable mass phenomena. To understand what happened in Strasbourg that summer, you need to understand the world these people inhabited. In 1518, Strasbourg was a free city within the Holy Roman Empire, prosperous and important, a center of trade and culture along the Rhine River. With a population of about 20,000, it was one of the largest cities in the region, known for its magnificent cathedral, its bustling markets, and its relatively sophisticated urban life. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, Strasbourg in 1518 was a city on the edge of collapse. The previous years had been catastrophic for Strasbourg's population. Between 1505 and 1517, the region had experienced repeated crop failures. Harvests failed. Grain stores depleted. People starved. The years immediately preceding 1518 had been particularly brutal, with widespread malnutrition weakening the population. The early 16th century saw waves of epidemic disease sweeping through Europe. Smallpox, syphilis, which had arrived in Europe just 20 years earlier, and what was called the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that killed rapidly, had all taken their toll on Strasbourg. Bodies weakened by hunger fell easily to disease. The sweating sickness deserves special mention. This illness would strike suddenly, causing victims to sweat profusely, experience agonizing pains, and often die within 24 hours. It appeared without warning, killed without mercy, and disappeared as mysteriously as it came. The terror it inspired cannot be overstated. Imagine a disease where you could be healthy in the morning and dead by evening for no reason anyone understood. The famines and diseases had devastated Strasbourg's economy. Trade diminished. Poverty spread. The gap between rich and poor widened. The city's social fabric was fraying. 1517 had seen Martin Luther nail his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, sparking the Protestant Reformation. By 1518, religious controversy was tearing through the Holy Roman Empire. Old certainties were crumbling. The Church, which had provided the framework for understanding the world, was under attack. This added spiritual anxiety to physical suffering. The people of 1518 Strasbourg lived in a world haunted by supernatural threats. They believed in demons, witches, curses, and divine punishments. They believed that God, or the devil, or the saints could intervene directly in human affairs, striking down the wicked or testing the faithful. In particular, there was a widespread belief in Saint Vitus and his curse. Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr, a patron saint invoked for protection against various afflictions, including epilepsy, nervous disorders, and crucially, compulsive dancing. But Saint Vitus was a double-edged saint. While he could protect against these afflictions, he could also inflict them as punishment. If you angered Saint Vitus, if you failed to properly honor him, if you committed certain sins, he could curse you with his dance, a compulsion to move uncontrollably until you died or were forgiven. This wasn't some obscure folk belief. It was widely accepted religious doctrine in early 16th century Strasbourg. People genuinely feared Saint Vitus's curse, and that fear, as we'll see, may have been the key to everything that followed. After Frau Troffea had been dancing for about 6 days, others began joining her. At first, it was just a handful, people who perhaps felt sympathy for her, or who were drawn by curiosity, or who themselves began to feel the compulsion. But within a week, 34 people were dancing uncontrollably in various parts of the city. Historical accounts are remarkably consistent in describing what the dancing looked like. It was not coordinated or graceful. Witnesses described it as wild, frantic, spasmodic. Dancers moved continuously, without rest, as if driven by some external force. They showed signs of distress, crying while dancing, calling out for help, expressions of terror on their faces. Many tried to resist, but couldn't. Their bodies moved against their will. The dancing continued day and night. Dancers only stopped when they physically collapsed from exhaustion. After collapsing and resting briefly, they would resume dancing, as if compelled. One chronicle from the time describes dancers with swollen blood vessels on their feet and hands. Another mentions a lot of shrieking and moaning. Yet another describes how dancers were turning and twisting their bodies without pause. This was not joyful. This was not celebratory. This was suffering expressed through unwilling movement. The majority of the dancers appear to have been women. Historical records suggest that women outnumbered men by a significant ratio, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. Many were from the poorer classes, people who had suffered most during the recent famines and plagues. This demographic pattern is crucial to understanding what happened. These were people under maximum stress, people who had endured years of hunger and disease, people at the bottom of society's hierarchy with no power to control their circumstances. The dancing spread in a way that contemporary observers described as contagious. Someone would see the dancers, and then they too would begin dancing. It jumped from person to person, from street to street, from neighborhood to neighborhood. By the end of the first week, the dancers had become impossible to ignore. They were everywhere in the city center, in the market square, in narrow alleys near the cathedral. The sound of their feet on cobblestones, their cries and moans filled the air. Strasbourg was beginning to realize it had a crisis on its hands. The City Council of Strasbourg faced an unprecedented problem. Dozens, soon to be hundreds, of their citizens were dancing uncontrollably through the streets, unable or unwilling to stop, many of them dying in the process. What were they supposed to do? The council first consulted with the city's physicians, the learned medical men who understood, or claimed to understand, the workings of the human body according to the medical theories of the time. The physicians examined the dancers and came to a consensus diagnosis. This was a natural disease, not a supernatural affliction. Specifically, they diagnosed it as a condition caused by hot blood. According to the medical theory of the time, based on the ancient Greek idea of humors, the human body contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Disease occurred when these were out of balance. The physicians believed the dancers had an excess of blood that had become overheated, causing it to rise to the brain and produce the compulsive movements. This diagnosis led to a treatment plan that, in retrospect, was catastrophically wrong. If the problem was hot blood that needed to be released, the physicians reasoned, then the solution was to encourage more dancing. The dancers needed to dance it out, to exhaust the hot blood through continued movement until the body returned to balance. Yes, you heard that correctly. The official medical response to people dancing themselves to death was to make them dance more. The city council, acting on this advice, took extraordinary steps. They built wooden stages in public spaces, the horse market and the grain market, specifically for the dancers to use. They hired professional musicians, pipers, drummers, horn players to provide music for the dancers. If they were going to dance themselves to exhaustion, might as well have music to guide them. They hired professional dancers, healthy people who could dance alongside the afflicted, to keep them going and to model proper exhaustion-inducing movement. They organized shifts of healthy citizens to support the dancers, catching them when they fell, giving them water, helping them continue when they faltered. Imagine the scene: wooden stages erected in Strasbourg's main squares, musicians playing hour after hour, professional dancers demonstrating movements, and in the center, the afflicted, dozens, perhaps hundreds, spinning, jerking, crying out, bleeding from their feet, their eyes showing terror and confusion, unable to stop. It was meant to be a cure. It became hell. The plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of the dancing exhausting itself, it intensified. More people joined: the music, the stages, the public attention. All of it seemed to make the phenomenon worse, not better. Healthy citizens who had been sent to help the dancers sometimes found themselves beginning to dance too. The contagion was spreading, fed by the very measures meant to contain it, and people were dying. The exact number of deaths is one of the most controversial aspects of the dancing plague. Historical sources vary wildly. Some chronicles claim that approximately 15 people died per day at the height of the plague. If true, and if this rate persisted for weeks, the death toll could have been in the hundreds. However, official city records from Strasbourg, which usually meticulously documented deaths, make no mention of unusual mortality during this period. This has led some historians to question whether anyone actually died. But here's what we know. Multiple independent sources from the time mention deaths. Different chronicles, different observers, different documents, all mention people dying from the dancing. The idea that they were all wrong or lying seems unlikely. The most probable explanation is that deaths did occur but weren't recorded in the usual way because the city was in chaos and normal record-keeping broke down. Deaths of poor people, who made up most of the dancers, weren't always officially recorded, and authorities may have had reasons to downplay the death toll. Medical historians who have studied the phenomenon believe deaths would have occurred through several mechanisms: heart attacks from exhaustion of the cardiac muscle, strokes from extreme exertion and dehydration, physical injuries from falling during convulsions, and starvation from dancers being too compelled to eat. Whether 15 per day or fewer, people were dying. And Strasbourg was in terror. After perhaps 2 weeks of the dancing stage strategy making things worse, the city council radically changed course. They consulted with religious authorities and came to a new conclusion. This wasn't a natural disease after all. This was the curse of Saint Vitus. The council issued new decrees. All public dancing was immediately forbidden, on pain of punishment. All music in public spaces was banned. No pipers, no drummers, no singing. The stages were torn down. Professional dancers were dismissed. If Saint Vitus had cursed these people, then making them dance more was the worst possible response. Instead, they needed to be separated from anything that might encourage dancing. The religious solution to Saint Vitus's curse was clear. The afflicted needed to seek forgiveness and healing at a shrine dedicated to the saint. There was such a shrine, the Chapel of Saint Vitus at Saverne, about 30 miles from Strasbourg, in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains. The city organized for groups of dancers to be taken there. They were loaded onto carts, many too weak to walk after weeks of dancing, and transported to the shrine. There, they were made to confess their sins, given blessed objects to wear, walked around the altar, made to place small offerings, and told to pray for Saint Vitus's mercy. Historical accounts say that after visiting the shrine, many dancers did stop. Whether from the religious intervention, from sheer exhaustion, from the psychological effect of believing they'd been cured, or from simply being removed from Strasbourg and its contagious atmosphere, the dancing began to abate. By September 1518, approximately 8 weeks after it had begun, the dancing plague had ended. The last dancers stopped. The streets returned to normal. Life in Strasbourg resumed its usual patterns. But the city had been traumatized. Hundreds had been afflicted. An unknown number had died. The event was so extraordinary that chroniclers immediately began recording it, knowing that future generations would find it almost impossible to believe. We know about the dancing plague because it was extensively documented. Physicians' notes from doctors who examined the dancers. Cathedral sermons from priests trying to explain the event. City council records detailing the official response. Regional chronicles from Strasbourg and surrounding areas. Personal accounts from witnesses. One of the most detailed contemporary descriptions comes from a physician named Paracelsus, who visited Strasbourg shortly after the events and interviewed witnesses. He wrote that the dancers moved as if possessed, and that many fell down dead after dancing for several days. Another chronicle, written in 1636 by Daniel Specklin based on earlier sources now lost, states, "In the year 1518 AD, there occurred among people a strange epidemic. One woman began to dance. In one day, about 34 joined her, and within 4 weeks, around 400 people were seized by this mania of dancing. They were taken to the chapel of St. Vitus, and they were cured there. The event was so notable that artists depicted it. The famous Flemish artist Peter Bruegel the Elder created drawings of dancing mania, though not specifically of the 1518 event. These images show wild-eyed dancers in contorted poses, their movements clearly involuntary and disturbing. For over 500 years, historians, medical experts, psychologists, and others have tried to explain what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. None of the theories is fully satisfactory. All have significant problems. One of the earliest modern explanations was that the dancers had consumed bread made from rye contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on damp grain. Ergot contains compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning, called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and convulsions, feelings of burning in the extremities, gangrene of the limbs in severe cases, and death. Evidence for ergot theory. Rye was a staple grain in 1518 Strasbourg. Damp conditions in the preceding years could have promoted ergot growth. Ergotism was well known in medieval Europe and could cause convulsions. Problems with ergot theory. Ergot typically causes random muscle spasms, not coordinated dancing movements. Ergotism isn't contagious. It doesn't spread from person to person by observation. Ergot poisoning usually affects everyone who eats the contaminated bread, not just some people. The symptoms don't fully match. Ergotism causes pain and burning, which dancers didn't report. The pattern of spread, person to person, following social networks, doesn't match ergot poisoning. Historian John Waller, who has studied the event extensively, specifically researched and rejected the ergot theory. The currently most accepted explanation among historians and medical experts is that the dancing plague was an epidemic of mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria. This is a real medical phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms in a group of people. It's not fake or people pretending. The symptoms are genuinely experienced and can be severe. How mass psychogenic illness works. A population is under extreme stress. Cultural beliefs provide a template for how that stress might manifest physically. One person, the index case, exhibits symptoms matching that template. Others, witnessing this and sharing the same stresses and beliefs, unconsciously begin exhibiting similar symptoms. The phenomenon spreads through social networks, especially affecting those most vulnerable. The stress factors were overwhelming. Years of famine, epidemic diseases, economic collapse, religious turmoil, widespread belief in supernatural punishment. The cultural template existed, widespread belief in St. Vitus's curse. Previous dancing manias had occurred in the region in 1374, 1463, and others. People expected that divine punishment might take the form of compulsive dancing. The spreading pattern matches, started with one person, spread to others through observation, followed social networks, mostly affected lower-class women, stopped when the cultural context changed, removal to shrine, end of public dancing. Historical precedent. Similar dancing manias had occurred repeatedly in medieval Europe. All occurred in regions with specific cultural beliefs about cursed dancing. All occurred during periods of extreme stress. Modern parallels. Mass fainting epidemics in schools. Outbreaks of twitching or tics spreading through friend groups. The 1962 Tanganyika laughter epidemic, interestingly, very similar to Strasbourg. John Waller, whose 2009 book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, is the definitive modern account of the event, argues convincingly for mass psychogenic illness. He points out, the minds of the choreomaniacs were drawn inwards, tossed about on the violent seas of their deepest fears. Waller notes that the people of 1518 Strasbourg were living in what they perceived as the end times. Famine, disease, social collapse, these were the signs of divine judgment. They expected punishment. They believed St. Vitus could curse them with uncontrollable dancing. When Frau Troffea began dancing, others who shared her stress, her fears, and her cultural beliefs unconsciously began manifesting the same symptoms. It wasn't deliberate. It wasn't faking. It was the human stress response, shaped by cultural expectations, spreading through a vulnerable population like wildfire. Problems with mass psychogenic illness theory. It doesn't fully explain the physical severity, death from dancing. Some historians find it too convenient as an explanation. It relies on psychological mechanisms that are difficult to prove retrospectively. Some question whether psychological stress alone could produce such extreme physical symptoms. Some historians have suggested the dancers were actually members of a heretical religious sect, deliberately dancing as part of a ritual or protest. Evidence. The medieval period had numerous heretical movements. Dancing was used in some religious rituals. The targeting of St. Vitus shrines could suggest religious motivation. Problems. Contemporary accounts make clear that dancing was involuntary and distressing. Dancers included people from across society, not just one group. The pattern of spread doesn't match organized religious activity. There's no evidence of any such cult in Strasbourg at the time. A more sinister theory. Someone deliberately poisoned the dancers with a fiat, substance that caused convulsions, perhaps as part of a plot or experiment. Problems. No evidence of who would do this or why. The spreading pattern doesn't match poisoning. No substance known to produce these specific effects. Would require massive conspiracy to keep secret. Perhaps the most honest answer is that multiple factors combined. Malnutrition and disease had weakened people physically. Extreme psychological stress had made them vulnerable to suggestion. Cultural beliefs about St. Vitus provided the form the symptoms took. One person's breakdown triggered others. The city's response, dancing stages, music, amplified rather than controlled it. Some cases may have been different from others, ergot poisoning in a few, mass hysteria in most. The truth likely exists at the intersection of psychology, sociology, medicine, and culture, a perfect storm of factors that could only have happened in that specific place, at that specific time, under those specific circumstances. The 1518 Strasbourg event was not unique. It was the most famous and best documented, but similar dancing manias occurred repeatedly in medieval and Renaissance Europe. In 1374, about 150 years before Strasbourg, a massive dancing plague swept through the Rhine and Moselle River regions, affecting dozens of towns and cities. It began in Aachen, modern-day Germany, and spread along the Rhine. Thousands of people were eventually affected. Dancers formed processions, moving from town to town, their numbers growing as they went. Contemporary accounts describe dancers leaping high in the air, forming circles and dancing in groups, shouting out the names of demons and collapsing when anyone mentioned St. John the Baptist. This outbreak lasted for months and affected a much wider geographic area than the 1518 event. Strasbourg itself had experienced a similar event 55 years before the famous 1518 outbreak. This earlier plague in 1463 was less severe and less well documented, but it established Strasbourg as a place where such things could happen. The fact that it had happened before may have made the 1518 outbreak more likely. The cultural memory of compulsive dancing made it a more available template for stress to manifest. Dancing manias were reported in Basel, Switzerland multiple times, Cologne, Germany, Metz, France, various towns in the Low Countries, modern Belgium and Netherlands, and parts of Italy. All of these outbreaks shared common features. Occurred during periods of stress like plague, famine, war. Affected regions with specific religious beliefs about cursed dancing. Started with one or a few individuals and spread. Involved seemingly involuntary dancing that continued until exhaustion. Eventually ended when religious interventions were performed. One of the great mysteries is why dancing manias largely disappeared after the 16th century. There have been no similar outbreaks in modern times, at least. None documented in Europe or North America. Possible explanations. Changes in cultural beliefs. People no longer believe in St. Vitus's curse, so stress doesn't manifest that way. Improved living conditions. Less extreme stress from famine and plague. Better medical understanding. Modern medicine would intervene differently. Different cultural templates. Modern stress might manifest in different physical symptoms. While dancing plagues per se don't occur anymore, similar phenomena do. Mass fainting epidemics in schools, especially in developing countries. Outbreaks of unexplained neurological symptoms spreading through friend groups. Social media influenced tic disorders. Recent cases of teenagers developing tics after watching TikTok videos of people with tics. These modern cases suggest that the human tendency for stress to manifest physically and spread socially hasn't disappeared. It's just taken different forms. The dancing plague of 1518 has had a lasting impact on culture, art, and our understanding of the human mind. The event has inspired numerous artistic works. Peter Bruegel the Elder created several works depicting dancing mania, including a famous drawing from 1564 showing writhing dancers. Choreomania by Florence and the Machine in 2022 was directly inspired by the event, with the entire album Dance Fever exploring themes of compulsive movement and loss of control. Jonathan Glazer's short film Strasbourg 1518 in 2020, broadcast during the COVID-19 lockdown, drew parallels between the medieval dancing plague and modern pandemic isolation. The graphic novel The Dancing Plague by Gareth Brooks in 2021 reimagines the event in striking visual form. The dancing plague has become a case study in several fields. In mass psychogenic illness, textbooks use it as a historical example of how psychological stress can manifest as physical symptoms in groups. In cultural psychiatry, it demonstrates how symptoms of mental distress are shaped by cultural context. In medical history, it shows how medical practice was conducted in the early modern period. In social psychology, it illustrates social contagion and suggestion. The dancing plague remains relevant because it raises questions we still grapple with. The mind-body connection. How much can psychological states affect physical health? Can stress literally make your body move against your will? Social contagion. How do behaviors and symptoms spread through populations? What makes people susceptible? Cultural context. How do cultural beliefs shape our experiences of illness and distress? Mass phenomena. What causes large groups of people to spontaneously exhibit similar behaviors? These aren't just historical questions. In an age of social media, where behaviors and ideas spread instantly across global networks, understanding how psychological phenomena spread through populations is more relevant than ever. When Jonathan Glazer created his short film Strasbourg 1518 and broadcast it on BBC during the first COVID-19 lockdown in April 2020, it wasn't an arbitrary choice. Glazer saw parallels between medieval Strasbourg and modern pandemic life: isolation and community. Both the dancing plague and COVID-19 created situations where people were isolated yet connected to a larger suffering. Physical manifestation of stress. In 1518, stress became dancing. During COVID, people experienced a range of stress-related physical symptoms. Loss of control. Both situations involved people experiencing their bodies doing things they couldn't control. The search for meaning. In 1518, people tried to understand through religion. During COVID, we tried through science. Both represented attempts to impose order on chaos. The need to move. Glazer's film showed dancers around the world, isolating but dancing, movement as expression, as release, as communication when words fail. The dancing plague reminds us that humans under extreme stress do extraordinary things. Our bodies and minds are not as separate as we like to think. When our psychological world becomes unbearable, sometimes our physical world revolts. Let's return to where we started. Frau Troffea stepping into that July street in 1518 and beginning to dance. We know almost nothing about her as a person. We don't know her first name. We don't know her age, though she was likely middle-aged or older. We don't know her occupation, though she was probably not wealthy. We don't know if she survived. After her initial dancing, she disappears from the historical record. But we can imagine her world. She had lived through years of hunger. Perhaps she had buried children who died in the famines or from disease. Perhaps she had watched her standard of living decline as Strasbourg's economy struggled. Perhaps she had heard the apocalyptic sermons about God's judgment and wondered when it would fall on her. On that July morning, something in her broke. Or perhaps something was finally released. The stress, the fear, the suffering. It had to go somewhere. And in the world of 1518 Strasbourg, where people believed in St. Vitus's curse, where compulsive dancing was an understood possibility, her body found that outlet. She began to dance. And in dancing, she gave form to what many others were feeling. She became the visible expression of invisible pain. And others, seeing her, recognizing their own suffering in hers, joined her. This is why the dancing plague matters. Not because it's weird or bizarre or entertaining, though it is all of those things. It matters because it shows us something profound about being human. We are social creatures. What affects one of us can affect all of us. Pain spreads like flame. We are embodied creatures. Our psychological states don't stay in our minds. They inhabit our bodies, shape our movements, express themselves physically. We are cultural creatures. The forms our suffering takes are shaped by what our culture tells us is possible. In 1518, Strasbourg, suffering became dancing. In other times and places, it takes other forms. We are meaning-seeking creatures. When inexplicable things happen, we need explanations. In 1518, they found explanations in St. Vitus. Today, we find them in psychology and neuroscience. Both are attempts to make sense of the fundamentally mysterious nature of human consciousness and suffering. More than 500 years later, questions remain. Did people really die? The death toll remains controversial. Some sources say hundreds. Official records are silent. The truth is somewhere in between. Why dancing specifically? Of all the ways stress could manifest, why that particular form of movement? Why not some other symptom? Why did it stop? What changed in September 1518 that ended the plague? Was it the religious interventions? Pure exhaustion? Something else? Could it happen again? Could a dancing plague emerge in modern times? Or have we outgrown the cultural conditions that made it possible? What happened to Frau Troffea? After starting it all, she vanishes from history. Did she survive? Did she recover? Did she carry guilt for what she'd triggered? Were there other cases? How many dancing plagues occurred that weren't documented? In small villages, in remote areas, where no chroniclers were present to record them. The cobblestone street where Frau Troffea began dancing still exists in Strasbourg. You can walk on it today. The cathedral she would have seen is still there. The market squares where the dancing stages were built still host markets and festivals. But the world that produced the dancing plague is gone. We don't believe in St. Vitus's curse anymore. We understand stress and psychology differently. We have better food security, better medicine, better ways of coping with collective trauma. Yet the dancing plague refuses to stay in the past. It haunts us still, a reminder of human vulnerability and strangeness. It appears in art, in music, in literature. It's studied in universities. It's discussed in documentaries. It lives on in the collective memory of anyone who hears the story and thinks, that really happened? People really danced themselves to death? Yes, they really did. In the summer of 1518, on the streets of a medieval city under the shadow of its magnificent cathedral, hundreds of people danced, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't stop. They danced through pain, through exhaustion, some through death itself. They danced because their world had become unbearable, and their bodies found this terrible, beautiful, horrifying way to express what words could not. They danced because they were human, and humans under extreme stress do extraordinary things. They dance because sometimes when the world is too much, when suffering exceeds all capacity to endure, the body takes over and moves in ways the mind cannot control or understand. And they danced, ultimately, because in some deep place in the human psyche, where stress and belief and culture and biology all meet, there is the capacity for the inexplicable, for phenomena that defy simple explanation, that exist at the intersection of mind and body, individual and collective, known and unknown. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that for all our science, for all our understanding, there remain aspects of human experience that hover just beyond full comprehension. Not supernatural, but not fully natural either. Not impossible to explain, but impossible to explain simply. It reminds us that we are strange creatures, capable of strange things, that our bodies can betray us in the most unexpected ways, that suffering spreads, that belief shapes reality, that sometimes the only way forward is to dance. And somewhere in the streets of Strasbourg, if you listen carefully on a hot July afternoon, you might still hear it, the sound of feet on cobblestones, moving to music no one else can hear, dancing a dance that began 500 years ago, and in memory never quite stopped. The dancing plague ended in September 1518, but the questions it raised still move through human consciousness, still make us wonder, still make us ask, what would we do if our world became unbearable? How would our suffering express itself? What strange forms might our stress take? We like to think we're too sophisticated, too modern, too rational for something like the dancing plague. But are we? In a world of pandemic isolation, economic uncertainty, political division, and existential dread about the future, are we so different from the people of 1518 Strasbourg? They danced. We scroll endlessly through social media, unable to stop. They saw devils and divine judgment. We see conspiracies and apocalypse. They sought meaning in saints. We seek it in science. The forms change. The human need for sense in nonsense, for control in chaos, for expression of the inexpressible, that remains constant. The dancing plague of 1518 is not just history. It's a mirror. And when we look into it, we see not medieval strangers, but ourselves. Vulnerable, strange, capable of both suffering and transcendence. Forever trying to make sense of a world that sometimes defies all sense. The music has stopped. The dancers have rested. But the dance, the eternal human dance between order and chaos, reason and madness, control and surrender, that dance continues. And so does the mystery, and so does the fascination, and so does the haunting question. If it happened to them, could it happen to us? Strasbourg, 1518. 500 years ago. A lifetime ago. Yesterday. Tomorrow. The dance never truly ends.